All right, let's dive into a world of incredible rarity and, honestly, staggering value. We're talking about fancy color diamonds. And these aren't just beautiful gems. For a very specific group of investors, they might just be one of the most stable assets on the entire planet.
And when I say stable, I really mean it. What you're looking at here, this isn't just a pile of jewelry. These are some of the rarest minerals on Earth, a totally unique asset class that's famous for its amazing consistency. Each one of these tells a story, not just about geology, but about what it means to hold on to value. But, recently a headline about the 2025 market made a lot of people sit up and pay attention. It kind of seemed to suggest a crack in this famously stable facade. So what was all the fuss about? What actually happened?
This is the number that caused the stir. In 2025, the overall price index for all fancy color diamonds dipped by 1%. Now look, in almost any other market, that could be the start of a bad news story. But in this world, that little number tells a completely different tale.
And this is the part you really have to wrap your head around. The experts over at the Fancy Color Research Foundation basically said, hey, a shift this small isn't a red flag at all. It's actually a sign of a healthy, mature market that doesn't go on wild roller coaster rides. But let's break that number down, because not all colors had the same year. So let's get into the nitty-gritty and look at the big three: yellows, blues, and pinks. Each color has its own unique story for the year, with some clear winners and losers that show us exactly what buyers were hunting for in 2025. We're going to start with yellow diamonds. As a whole category, they saw the biggest dip, falling about 1.9%. But even that number is hiding some really fascinating details when you look closer. And here's where it gets interesting. See, while some of the bigger Yellowstones saw their prices slide, the smaller, fancy, intense ones, that means they have a really strong, rich color, their value actually went up by 1.1%. It just goes to show you how selective the demand is. People are after very specific sizes and saturations. Okay, now for the blues. This is where the story gets really good. Even though they were down just a tiny bit for the whole year, they were the only color that actually saw prices go up in the last quarter of 2025. That proves just how resilient and sought after they really are. I mean, this just screams rarity is king. The absolute top tier, fancy vivid blues, we're talking the purest, most intense color you can imagine. They saw some serious gains. An 8-carat stone jumped over 2%. At the same time, the slightly less saturated stones dipped a bit. The market is absolutely chasing the best of the best. And of course, we've got to talk about the beloved pinks. Just like the others, they saw a tiny little dip overall for the year, but hidden inside that number were some really strong performances that just underscore their timeless appeal.
So you're saying the pattern here, right? It's all about selective demand. Specific categories, like a 2-carat fancy intense or a 1-carat fancy vivid pink, were hot commodities, pushing prices up. Buyers weren't just looking for any old pink diamond. They were zeroing in on very specific, highly desirable stones. Okay, so we've looked at the numbers, but that brings us to the really big question. Why? Why does this market behave so differently from things like stocks or real estate? For that, let's bring in an expert's opinion.
No, seriously, think about it for a second. In what other universe is a 1% dip considered a sign of rock-solid stability? What is it about these gems that makes them play by a completely different set of rules?
This quote from Druval Delakia really nails it. He talks about a different discipline. The people buying and selling these stones, they aren't day traders. They are building collections, building inventory for the long, long haul. They aren't getting spooked by what he calls short-term price noise.
And that idea, ignoring the short-term noise, is the perfect way to get to our final point. Because to truly, truly understand the story of these diamonds, you can't just look at 1 year. You've got to zoom out, like way out.
So the Fancy Color Research Foundation has been tracking all this since 2005. That gives us 2 full decades of perspective. And when you look at that whole 20-year timeline, that little 1% dip in 2025 starts to look, well, completely insignificant. Let's look at the real story here. Since 2005, the value of pink diamonds hasn't just gone up, it has skyrocketed. Get this, by an incredible 391%. What about blue diamonds? They're up a massive 242% over that same time. And even the yellows, which are a bit more common, have seen a rock-solid 47% gain. When you see these numbers, that 1% dip suddenly looks like nothing more than a tiny blip on the radar, right? So when you put it all together, what's the big picture? What does that tiny little 1% dip in 2025 really mean in the grand scheme of things? At the end of the day, the fancy colored diamond market is just playing a different game. This isn't about quick flips or speculative bubbles. It's a market built on two things: extreme rarity and a deliberate long-term vision. That 1% dip isn't a crack in the foundation. It's just proof of how incredibly solid that foundation really is.
Which kind of leaves us with one final thought. In a world that's so often driven by fleeting trends and just so much volatile, short-term noise, could an asset class with this kind of unwavering, quiet stability be the ultimate definition of true value? It's definitely something to think about.